our first chat of 2025, and you were out of the gate this week with a very big story in terms of development in the city, with Concord's coming up with at least their vision for the end of Falls Creek there. What do we know?
Yeah, so this is Concord Pacific has come out just this week with it's still kind of early days, preliminary, but they've released this idea for developing that section of Northeast Falls Creek they own, where it's a part of the former Expo lands. This is kind of the area, it's largely empty today. It's basically the stretch of shorefront between the Plaza of Nations and Science World. So it's where like the Cirque du Soleil tents are currently set up there, and it's used for staging and for various events and stuff. But it's mostly empty, and it's obviously a very valuable piece of waterfront property. And Concord, after developing so much of the rest of the Expo lands in that shore along the north side of Falls Creek over the last couple of decades, they say they're finally kind of moving ahead to pull the trigger and develop this last piece. And it's a big development. They're talking about 12 towers, some of which, the VP of development was saying to me, some of which could be 65 plus stories, which is worth no. I mean, Vancouver's current tallest tower, the Shangri-La, is 62 stories. So Concord is envisioning, or at least at this stage, they're envisioning towers there that could be taller than anything that currently stands in Vancouver. In the city of Vancouver proper. And then, so they're talking about 5,000 homes and as well as a bunch of other, shops and services and restaurants. They're talking about having a dozen restaurants along the waterfront there. And it would come with parks and a bunch of other amenities. But of course, one of the interesting and potentially challenging things is the whole thing appears to be kind of contingent on the Georgia and Dunsmuir viaducts coming down. The viaducts kind of run along. They're just kind of near the property to the north. And obviously that has been the city of Vancouver's plan for many years now, is the direction from council a few councils ago is to go ahead and remove the viaducts and replace them with kind of a ground level street network, and which would free up more space for buildings, but also parks and public space. So that is still the city's plan. They haven't changed course on the viaduct removal, but it's just a totally open question of when it might happen, and importantly, how it might be paid for, because it'll be very expensive.
What I think your story said the last estimate, and that was a few years ago, was what, $500 million.
$500 million, yeah. So the last estimate the city kind of detailed costing the city did was, I think it was like in the lead up to the Northeast Falls Creek plan, which was approved by a previous council back in 2018. And so that was between 400 and 500 million somewhere. And so it's 2018. So that's 7 years ago now. And folks at City Hall said they don't really know they don't have a good idea of what the current number is, except that they're confident it's higher than that. The cost of all kinds of infrastructure projects have gone up, of course. So they're saying, it would be more than what they were looking at 7 years ago.
And Concord and at least one other developer have set aside some money or contributed some money towards the teardown.
Well, yeah. I mean, so Concord contributed $110 million cash contribution to the city, not in connection with this specific development, but as part of a different arrangement that involved there were these sites that were designated for social housing. Now there were 6 sites. Now Concord's going to develop 3 of them as market housing. The city and BC Housing are going to develop 3 of them as social housing. And these were different sites elsewhere in the former Expo lands kind of area. Anyway, so Concord had contributed $110 million cash contribution to the city as part of that agreement, and the city has earmarked that for the viaduct removal. And then the owner of the nearby Plaza of Nations site had contributed $100 million as part of a rezoning that was approved a few years ago. And then that has kind of been earmarked for the viaduct removal. Now it's worth noting it's been earmarked, but it hasn't. Those funds, the $210 million, haven't been officially kind of allocated by council, so they could potentially go towards some other city priorities if I think it would be up to council. But even with that 210 million, was probably less than half of the money needed that was estimated 7 years ago. So it's going to be obviously a smaller fraction of what actually would be needed today, and then who knows what's going to be needed in the future. Now, this week's news about Concord looking to build 5,000 homes and 12 towers on this parcel of land, presumably through the rezoning negotiations with City Hall, that the city would be trying to extract more money from Concord for this rezoning, and then some of that money could potentially be going to the viaducts. And then there are other property owners in the area, but I mean, this is the single biggest one, this Concord piece of land. So the city will, it seems like through the negotiations with Concord, be trying to extract money to make the viaduct removal happen. And at least one city councilor, Sarah Kirby-Young, told me yesterday she assumes that, considering the size of the project, she doesn't think it's going to be possible to fund it solely through fund the removal of the viaducts solely through developer contributions. She thinks they'll need to have some kind of a contribution from the province. They'll need to have the province step up to the plate with some kind of infrastructure funding.
It goes back, how many decades were those viaducts built?
They were built in the 1960s. They opened they opened to the public. I think they were completed in the early 1970s. And so It's kind of interesting. They were basically designed as part of a freeway system, a broader freeway system that of course was never built. So the viaducts were built to support this freeway system, but then the freeway system was canceled in the early 1970s, I think was it Team Civic Government? And so the freeways were never built, but the viaducts are there. They're kind of a vestige. I mean, that's the way the city describes them. I was talking yesterday to the city's chief engineer, Lon Leclerc, kind of described them as like kind of a relic, or he didn't say relic, but they're kind of a vestige of something. They don't really suit the purpose ideally for what the city wants. Now, obviously, I'm sure there are going to be some commuters, people who commute from east of downtown into downtown and out, who use the viaducts every day and find them a really efficient way to get around, who might be frustrated by their removal. But
well, they're definitely going to want to know what's replacing it, because right now, as you know, sometimes of the day, those viaducts could be just jammed, particularly right. They're very well used.
Yeah.
As a means to get in and out of the city. Who would have built them at the time? Was it the city? Did the city pay for them, or the province? If it was part of the highway system, or
not sure.
Yeah. Whose responsibility are they? I guess they're the city's responsibility now, though, regardless of who paid for them.
I don't know. And who would be responsible for the remediation costs, which would be significant? I'm not sure 100%. I don't know.
It's interesting because really, this is an infrastructure project, as you say, but it's almost like a reverse infrastructure project, in the sense that you're not putting something up, you're taking something down.
Yeah. And changing it, right? Like the idea is to replace it with a street, like a ground level street network, more like what
expensive.
You have. Oh, for sure. Yeah. Building a whole new street network, it wouldn't be cheap. I mean, Lon Leclerc, the city engineer, was saying that it's kind of, because at one time, I believe the viaducts went over some rail lines, right? And like he's saying, like, we don't need this elevated railway. Like, I think the idea is that there would be a ramp, because obviously there's a significant change in elevation there from up where the library is down to the waterfront. So I think the idea is there'd be some kind of a ramp coming down Georgia, but that Georgia Street would basically continue down to the water somehow. I can't. There are renderings of it, but it's hard to kind of imagine.
Right. Well, and now I guess further complicating or creating other opportunities is you have the new St. Paul's Hospital precinct on the edge of it. So that all has to be integrated and fit together as well.
Yeah. And so at one time, I mean, I was just reading the other day, like when the previous Vision Vancouver Majority Council first gave this direction to staff to go proceed with exploring the removal and replacement of the viaducts in 2015, I think there was an expectation at that time that project would be done long before the new St. Paul's Hospital was up and running. And obviously that's probably, I mean, I don't know if you've been down there recently, but St. Paul's is like, they're building it. It's going. So I don't know how that's all going to work out. But I mean, that was another thing that Lon, the city engineer, mentioned to me, is, the viaducts are he says they're not very seismically sound. As out of ranking Vancouver's different infrastructure, it's one of the pieces they're really worried about. And if there is an earthquake, not only would it potentially kind of fall on the SkyTrain tracks, but it could potentially block access to and from the new St. Paul's Hospital, or at least impede it, which is something they're worried about. And there is a bit of a kind of a date they've got circled on their calendar. Like the Vancouver's current capital plan says that if the viaducts have not been sort of replaced by 2032, they're going to need a major upgrade. At least that's what the capital plan says. Like they would need a significant upgrade if they are going to keep them. They would need to put hundreds of millions of dollars into just kind of keeping them safe and operable. That's what the capital plan says.
Okay. Well, let's hope we're not still talking about this in 2032.
I don't know. There are certain stories that it feels like you talk about for years and years, and yeah. Anyway,
all right.
But everyone at City Hall says that this week's news from Concord, obviously, it's a ways away from the viaducts coming down, but the folks at City Hall say this is a significant step towards. It's still early days. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves. Concord hasn't even submitted an official application yet, but it's a step. It's a significant step, they say, in that process.
Okay. Well, I'm sure we'll be watching along with you to see where all that money's going to come from to ultimately make the change. But
that's
thanks, Dan.
$1 billion question. Okay, thanks, Harold.
All right.